Hey, before we begin, if you're settling in for the night and you found your way to this one, welcome. Take a moment to like the video if calm historical storytelling is something that helps you unwind. And subscribe if you want more of this, only if it genuinely resonates with you. And drop a comment letting us know where you heard about this video. A recommendation from a friend, a late night algorithm, something someone mentioned in passing. We always want to know how you found your way here. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's go somewhere extraordinary. Let's go to Rome. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The Rome you're imagining right now is probably magnificent. Marble columns rising into a clear Mediterranean sky. Triumphant arches, aqueducts marching across the hillsides like stone giants. Emperors in gleaming white robes. The Colosseum, the Forum. The roads stretching in every direction like the veins of a living empire, connecting the known world to the city at its center. That Rome existed. It was real, and it was extraordinary. But now imagine stepping off those marble streets, turning away from the temples and the monuments, walking into the side streets, the narrow lanes, the crowded quarters where the overwhelming majority of Rome's 1 million residents actually lived, actually breathed, actually struggled through their days and nights. Walk into the city behind the city, the Rome of the ordinary person, the laborer, the freedman, the woman carrying water up 5 flights of stairs, the child sleeping 3 to a room, the man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of the empire's greatness without ever tasting much of it himself. Because the Rome of the history books and the Rome of the lived experience were in many ways 2 entirely different places. And here is what surprises people most when they look carefully at the evidence. Rome at the height of its power. Rome when the empire stretched from the British Isles to the deserts of Mesopotamia. When its population was the largest of any city on earth. When its engineering achievements still astonish modern architects. That Rome was also one of the most dangerous, crowded, loud, dirty, and epidemiologically lethal places a human being could have found themselves living in the ancient world. The glory was real, but so was everything that lived behind it. Let's start with the basics. Let's start with the city itself, and with the sheer overwhelming fact of its size. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Rome had accumulated a population of somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people within its walls and immediate surroundings. This number, which modern demographers have assembled painstakingly from census records, grain distribution tallies, and architectural surveys, is staggering when you place it against the context of the ancient world. The next largest city in the Mediterranean was Alexandria, with perhaps 500,000. After that, the numbers dropped precipitously. Rome was not merely the largest city in its world. It was, in a meaningful sense, the only city of its kind. A genuinely metropolitan organism, a concentration of human density that the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for well over 1,000 years. And that density had consequences. The Roman Empire had constructed the most sophisticated road network, the most ambitious aqueduct system, and some of the most impressive public buildings in human history. Rome the city had 11 aqueducts by the 2nd century of the Common Era, supplying an estimated 1 billion liters of water per day, a figure that works out to roughly 1,000 liters per resident, which is more than most modern cities supply today. It had public baths, public fountains, a functioning sewer system, and hundreds of public latrines. By the standards of the ancient world, this was remarkable infrastructure. By the standards of what 1 million people actually require to stay healthy, it was in critical areas, nowhere near enough. The city never slept. That is not a poetic flourish. It is a documented fact, preserved in the complaints of Roman writers who found the noise intolerable and said so at considerable length. A municipal regulation, the Lex Julia Municipalis, prohibited wheeled freight traffic from entering the city during daylight hours, on the grounds that the streets were simply too congested. The solution, from the perspective of the city's logistics, was sensible. The consequence, for the people who lived in it, was that the nights were filled with the sound of iron-wheeled carts grinding over stone paving. The bellowing of oxen, the shouts of drivers, and the rattling of thousands of amphorae being delivered to the warehouses and markets that fed the city's appetite. Juvenal, the Roman satirist writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, described it with characteristic bluntness. The noise of the city, he said, would deprive even the deepest sleeper of rest. So the Romans were exhausted before the day even began. And when the day did begin, most of them woke up not in a house, but in an apartment building. This is the fact that perhaps most dramatically reshapes our understanding of what ancient Rome actually looked like from the inside. The Rome of the Hollywood imagination is a city of marble townhouses, private gardens, atrium courtyards, with fountains and mosaic floors. And those buildings existed. They were called domus, and the wealthy families of Rome's upper classes lived in them in considerable comfort. But the domus represented a tiny fraction of the city's actual residential architecture. The overwhelming majority of Romans, historians estimate somewhere between 80 and 90% of the city's population, lived in what the Romans called insulae. The word insula means island. And these apartment buildings were indeed islands of a kind, multi-story blocks of residential space rising above street-level commercial premises, surrounded on all sides by the narrow lanes and alleys of the urban grid. Built close together and packed with people, the insulae of Rome could reach 5, 6, even 8 or 9 stories in height before the Emperor Augustus, alarmed by the frequency of structural collapses, introduced regulations restricting them to approximately 70 Roman feet, roughly 21 meters. Later, after the catastrophic fire of 64, the Common Era, that limit was reduced further still. The reason those limits were necessary tells you everything you need to know about how these buildings were constructed. The ground floors and the lower levels were typically built from brick and Roman concrete and were structurally sound. This is where the wealthier tenants lived, the merchants, the skilled craftsmen, the small businessmen who could afford the more expensive lower floor apartments with their easier access to the street, their greater space, and their relative safety. As you climbed higher in the building, the construction changed. Timber floors replaced solid ones. Mud, brick, and wattle filled the upper walls. The staircases grew steeper and narrower. The rooms grew smaller and darker, hotter in summer and colder in winter. And the structural integrity of the building grew progressively more questionable with every additional story. The satirist Juvenal wrote about this with the kind of bitter specificity that suggests personal experience. He described landlords who covered over cracked walls with a thin layer of fresh plaster and told their tenants to sleep soundly, even as the building above them was on the verge of collapse. A building that falls, he noted, kills everyone inside with equal indifference to their guilt or innocence. The architect Vitruvius warned against exactly the kind of cost-cutting construction practices that made such collapses common. And Cicero, who owned several insulae as investment properties, wrote with apparent equanimity in a letter to a friend that 2 of his rental buildings had simply fallen down, not because he was troubled for his tenants, but because he was calculating how much more he could charge for the replacement structures. Fire was the other constant threat, and in many ways, the more terrifying one. An insula on fire did not give you time to calculate odds. It gave you seconds. The combination of timber upper floors, the open flames that every resident used for cooking and heating and light, oil lamps, charcoal braziers, open hearths, and the narrowness of the streets that made any attempt at firefighting extraordinarily difficult, created conditions in which a fire that started in one apartment could consume an entire block in under an hour. Landlords were officially prohibited from allowing braziers on upper floors, precisely because they knew the risk. The prohibition was widely ignored because residents needed warmth and had no other option. Augustus responded to the ongoing fire crisis by creating the Vigiles, a corps of approximately 7,000 men whose primary duty was fire suppression in the city. The Vigiles carried water buckets and hand pumps called siphos, and when a fire was beyond their ability to extinguish, they resorted to the most reliable ancient firefighting technique available. They demolished the buildings adjacent to the burning structure, creating a fire break that the flames could not cross. it was effective. It also meant that the buildings of your neighbors, which had nothing to do with the fire, were pulled down around you while you stood in the street and watched. The most famous fire in Rome's history came in the summer of 64 of the Common Era, during the reign of Nero. It started, according to the sources, somewhere in the area of the Circus Maximus, in a district dense with the kind of wooden commercial buildings and overcrowded insulae that burned efficiently. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights. When it finally went out, 3 of Rome's 14 administrative regions had been completely destroyed, and 7 more had been severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly homeless, their belongings, and in many cases their family members, consumed. The Emperor Nero, who by some accounts watched the fire from the Quirinal Hill, and by later legend played music while the city burned, opened the public gardens and emergency shelters in response, and rapidly commissioned new and more fire-resistant buildings for the destroyed districts. He also found it politically convenient to blame the catastrophe on the city's small but growing Christian community, setting in motion the first documented Roman persecution of Christians. The smell of the city was its own particular reality, and one that the ancient sources mention with a frequency that suggests it was overwhelming in a way that modern urban dwellers would find almost incomprehensible. Rome had the Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest sewer systems in the ancient world, originally constructed in the 6th century before the Common Era and expanded over subsequent centuries into a network of underground channels that drained the lower-lying districts of the city into the Tiber. It was a genuine engineering achievement, and parts of it still function today. But the Cloaca Maxima drained the city's major public spaces. It did not connect to the insulae. The apartment buildings in which most Romans lived had no sewer connections. Waste management was, for the vast majority of residents, a combination of chamber pots, designated waste pits, and the informal tradition of emptying containers from upper-floor windows into the street below. Roman law actually prohibited throwing waste from windows. The law also specified financial penalties for anyone whose discarded waste landed on a passerby. The existence of these specific legal provisions tells you, with perfect clarity, exactly how often they were violated. Juvenal described walking through Rome at night as a process of constant risk from above, watching not just for thieves, but for the contents of chamber pots deposited from the darkness overhead. The streets, particularly in the crowded working-class districts like the Suburra, were a mixture of human waste, animal dung, rotting organic material from the markets, and butcher stalls, and whatever water ran down from the fountains. The city was a place of extraordinary sensory intensity, and not all of those senses would have been pleasant ones. The public latrines, the Foracae, were one of Rome's genuinely democratic institutions. They were free, communal, and surprisingly social. They consisted of rows of stone seats, positioned over channels of running water that carried waste directly to the sewers, and they were built throughout the city in sufficient numbers that an estimated 144 public latrines existed in Rome by the 4th century. There were no privacy partitions between the seats. You sat next to your neighbors, conducted your business, and discussed the news of the day, the price of grain, the results of the chariot races, the latest rumors from the palace. Romans did not consider this arrangement strange. They had no frame of reference that would have made it so. The cleaning apparatus available in these latrines was the silospongium, a sponge mounted on a stick, shared by everyone who used the facility, rinsed between uses in a channel of vinegar water running along the floor. The German prisoner, mentioned by the philosopher Seneca, who suffocated himself by forcing a xylospongium down his own throat before being executed in the arena, was making use of what was, by Roman standards, the most accessible object in public spaces. The horror of Seneca's account rests not in the object itself, but in the extremity of the act, and the fact that such an object was near to hand says something precise about the ordinary conditions of Roman public life. Water came from the aqueducts, and Rome's aqueduct system was, as mentioned, one of the engineering wonders of the ancient world. But the distribution of that water within the city was deeply unequal. The wealthy residents of private domus homes could, with sufficient resources and the right connections to the city's water distribution network, have water piped directly to their property. The fountains and public basins were the end point for everyone else. And carrying water up the steep, narrow staircases of a 5- or 6-story insula to a room at the top was the daily labor of women and children throughout the city, repeated multiple times a day, consuming hours of effort that the wealthy never needed to think about. Now let us talk about the people who made all this possible in ways that Rome itself rarely acknowledged directly. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of the population of the city of Rome itself, and estimates for Italy as a whole range even higher, were enslaved. At the height of the Roman imperial period, historians believe that somewhere between 5 and 10 million people within the empire's total population existed in a condition of legal property, owned by other human beings, possessing no civil rights, no claim to their own labor, no legal protection against violence, and no right to refuse what their owners demanded of them. The scale of this is difficult to fully absorb. 1 in 3 people you passed on a Roman street might have been enslaved. The dinner that the wealthy Roman family ate had been prepared by an enslaved cook. The house in which they lived had been built and was maintained by enslaved workers. The children of wealthy Romans were often educated by enslaved tutors, frequently Greek men of considerable learning who had been captured in conquest or purchased from slave traders, and whose intellectual gifts were now the legal property of someone else. The records were kept by enslaved accountants. The letters were carried by enslaved messengers, wearing metal tags around their necks, engraved with instructions for their return if they were caught attempting escape. Slaves came to Rome through several pathways. Warfare was the most historically significant. A Roman military victory could produce thousands of enslaved people in a single campaign. Julius Caesar, during the Gallic Wars, sold the entire population of the besieged town of the Aduatuci, 53,000 people, to slave dealers on the spot. Others were purchased from traders who operated across the empire's borders, acquiring people through piracy, kidnapping, and the purchase of captives from smaller conflicts. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved from birth. And in a world without bankruptcy protection, debt could reduce a free person to slavery, a fate that was not hypothetical but a documented feature of Roman economic life. The experiences of enslaved people in Rome varied across an extraordinarily wide spectrum. A small number occupied positions of genuine influence: the educated secretary who managed the senator's correspondence, the physician who tended to a wealthy household, the bailiff who ran a large agricultural estate. Some accumulated savings, negotiated for their freedom, and became freedmen who eventually achieved Roman citizenship and even prosperity. This possibility of manumission was a real feature of Roman slavery and distinguished it, in some ways, from later systems of chattel slavery. But the existence of this pathway for a small minority should not obscure the reality of the vast majority. The slave working in a mine might live for 3 or 4 years after arriving there. The slave on an agricultural estate worked from before dawn to after dark, slept in barracks that the Roman agricultural writer Columella described matter-of-factly as prison-like, and had no legal recourse against any treatment their master chose to apply: branding, whipping, the iron collar with its return address tag, the gladiatorial school as a death sentence. All of these were documented features of Roman slavery, and none of them were considered exceptional or cruel by the society that practiced them. They were considered normal. The philosopher Seneca, who wrote with unusual compassion about the condition of enslaved people, made his argument for humane treatment explicitly on the grounds that it was morally right to recognize the humanity of those one owned. The fact that this argument needed to be made, that it was not self-evident, that it ran against the grain of prevailing Roman opinion, tells you something about the moral universe in which ordinary Romans lived. On the question of what Romans ate, the contrast between the Roman world of legend and the Roman world of documented fact is particularly striking. The image of the Roman feast, the spectacular excess of a wealthy dinner party, course after course of exotic foods, oysters from Britain, flamingo tongue, wine from every province of the empire, is real in the sense that such banquets occurred and were documented in detail by writers who attended them and found them either magnificent or obscene, depending on their temperament. But these banquets were the experience of a narrow elite, the senators and wealthy equestrians and their guests. They were not the experience of Rome. For most of Rome's population, daily food was simple to the point of monotony. Bread was the foundation of the Roman diet at every level. Dense, grain-based loaves produced in bakeries throughout the city, distributed in part through the annona, the state grain dole that provided free or subsidized grain to Rome's citizen population as a form of social management. The dole was politically essential. Emperors who failed to maintain it faced riots. It fed a significant portion of the city's poor and working population, and was one of the mechanisms by which the imperial government kept 1 million people from becoming 1 million hungry, angry people. Beyond bread, the diet of the Roman poor ran to pulses, lentils, chickpeas, beans, cooked into thick soups and stews, seasoned with the ubiquitous Roman condiment called garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans added to almost everything with the enthusiasm of a culture that had found its universal flavor agent. Vegetables, olives, and cheap wine completed the picture. Meat was expensive and infrequent. Fish, where available and affordable, appeared occasionally. For many Romans, animal protein came primarily from garum itself, technically a fish product, though by the time it had been fermented, salted, and aged in large clay jars under the Mediterranean sun, its relationship to the fish it had once been was purely ancestral. The thermopolia were Rome's version of the fast food counter, permanent stone counters with ceramic vessels sunk into their tops, holding prepared food they kept warm over coals, selling to the working population who had no kitchen in their apartment and no time to cook. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era and preserved in extraordinary detail, have revealed these establishments throughout the urban fabric, open to the street, busy during the morning and midday, offering the Roman equivalent of a quick lunch. The food was cooked on the premises, sometimes under conditions that the Roman sources suggest were not always hygienic, by establishments that varied enormously in quality and cleanliness. The taverns, the caepane, and the popine served wine alongside food and doubled as social centers, gambling dens, and meeting places for the collegia, the voluntary associations of tradesmen, freedmen, and workers that served as Rome's informal civil society. These associations provided funerals for their members, organized religious observances, offered a degree of mutual support in a world without any formal welfare institutions, and in some cases crossed the line into organized crime with a fluency that suggested the line was not always clearly marked. Roman gangs, some politically connected, some purely entrepreneurial, controlled certain neighborhoods and operated with a combination of bribery, violence, and the kind of informal territorial authority that law enforcement in Rome was never quite strong enough to consistently challenge. Because Rome had no professional police force in any modern sense, the vigiles were primarily firefighters. The urban cohorts, a military force of around 4,000 men stationed in Rome, could suppress serious public disorder, but their presence was not designed for the mundane work of preventing theft, assault, or the operations of criminal networks. Pickpockets worked the crowded forums. Cut purses operated in the markets. The alleys of districts like the Suburra, Rome's densest and most notorious working-class neighborhood, where Julius Caesar himself had lived before wealth and power lifted him elsewhere, were places where, according to the sources, a person walking alone at night was making a decision that deserved careful reconsideration. The night itself was the problem. Rome had no system of public street lighting. When darkness fell, the city streets were lit only by whatever light spilled from tavern windows, and the occasional lamp carried by a pedestrian with the means to hire a slave to carry a torch. For everyone else, navigating Rome after dark meant walking through genuine darkness in streets that were narrow and uneven, with open gutters and loose paving stones, while knowing that the darkness was also navigated by people whose purposes were not benign. The satirist Juvenal wrote with specific directness about night walks in Rome, advising the reader to make their will before venturing out to dinner, not as hyperbole, but as a practical suggestion. And he described the experience of a nocturnal assault in terms that suggested familiarity with the phenomenon. The lucky victim, he said, came away with bruises and a few missing teeth. The unlucky one did not come away at all. The Emperor Nero, according to the historian Suetonius, used to disguise himself as a common slave and wander the streets of Rome at night, specifically to assault random pedestrians and break into shops for the entertainment of it. One of his victims, not knowing who was attacking him, fought back with such effectiveness that Nero nearly required medical attention, and later forced the man to commit suicide in punishment for not recognizing his emperor fast enough. When it became known that the emperor himself was engaged in street crime as a hobby, Suetonius notes, the practice spread rapidly among those who had less complicated reasons for adopting it. The streets of Rome, it was said, became at night like a city that had been taken by an enemy. The medicine available to the Romans when all of this urban living caught up with their bodies was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely sophisticated. Rome had trained physicians, many of them Greek-educated, and drawing on a medical tradition that went back to Hippocrates and had been extended by centuries of systematic observation. The physician Galen, who practiced in Rome in the 2nd century and served as personal doctor to several emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, left behind an enormous body of medical writing that would remain authoritative in European medicine for over 1,000 years. Roman medicine understood anatomy, recognized the importance of diet and exercise, had genuine pharmacological knowledge, and performed surgical procedures of considerable complexity. But what Roman medicine did not have was germ theory. The idea that infectious disease was caused by microorganisms, invisible, specific, transmissible agents that could be destroyed by particular interventions, was simply not available to them. Disease, in the Roman medical framework, was understood as imbalance of the 4 humors, of the climate, of the patient's constitution and lifestyle. Treatment therefore focused on restoring balance through dietary adjustment, through rest, through the administration of herbal preparations that were often genuinely effective for specific complaints, and through bloodletting, which was the default intervention for almost any condition involving fever or inflammation, on the theory that excess blood was causing the imbalance. The bloodletting was not effective. The herbal preparations sometimes were. The gap between the two explains a great deal about Roman medical outcomes. Surgical practice was more successful, within its obvious limits. Roman military medicine in particular developed genuine competence at wound treatment, amputation, and the management of battlefield injuries, driven by the practical necessity of keeping an army operational. Arrow removal, bone setting, the management of infection through cauterization. These were skills that Roman military surgeons practiced with real frequency and developed through experience. The surgical instruments recovered from Pompeii, from military sites across the empire, and from the buried contents of physicians' kits demonstrate a toolkit of considerable sophistication. Scalpels, probes, forceps, hooks, and needles that correspond to procedures described in the medical texts. What they could not do was manage sepsis, an infection that entered a surgical wound, or that accompanied a compound fracture, or that set in after childbirth in a world without antibiotics, antiseptic technique, or the concept of sterile procedure could kill a patient who had survived the initial injury or procedure by days. This gap between the competence of Roman surgery and the impossibility of infection control defined the upper limit of what Roman medicine could achieve. And childbirth, in particular, killed women in numbers that we find difficult to fully grasp from the vantage point of modern obstetric care. Roman girls married in their early teens. The legal minimum age for girls was 12, with 15 considered the appropriate age for first pregnancy. Elite girls could be betrothed before puberty. The childbearing years thus began early, and the body's readiness to bear children did not always correspond to the legal minimum. Women who survived their fertile years, and many did not, often did so after multiple pregnancies, some of which were not survived, and under conditions of maternal care that were skilled within their own frame of reference, but limited by the total absence of the knowledge that would have saved the most lives. A woman in ancient Rome had approximately a 1 in 50 chance of dying in any given childbirth, with that risk increasing with each successive pregnancy. To maintain Rome's population at stable levels, demographic modeling suggests that the average Roman woman needed to have between 6 and 9 births across her lifetime. You can do the mathematics yourself, and the answer they produce is sobering. Female mortality was highest in the age range of 15 to 29, specifically because of this cause. Tombstones from across the empire document the pattern. Young women, their ages between 16 and 25. Their deaths attributed in the inscriptions to childbirth. One such inscription, recovered from North Africa, reads, "Sacred to the gods of the dead, Rusticia Matrona lived 25 years. The cause of my death was childbirth and a malignant fate." Another, from Rome itself, commemorates Ranus Sulpicia, formerly enslaved, who died giving birth at approximately 16 years old. The epitaph in elegiac verse notes that the child died with her. One heap of ashes, it says, holds a double funeral. Infants who survived the birth faced their own extraordinary mortality. 1 in 3 Roman children died before the age of 1. Half of all children born in Rome may not have reached their 10th birthday. This reality shaped Roman practice in ways that seem brutal to modern sensibilities, but were responses to genuine demographic pressure. Infants were not given names until 8 or 9 days after birth. The dies lustricus, a purification ceremony, because the probability of surviving that first week was low enough that the emotional investment of a full naming ceremony was not always warranted. The paterfamilias, the legal head of the household, had the right to accept or reject the newborn child. Rejection meant exposure, the abandonment of the infant in a public place where it might be taken in by another family or might not survive. This practice, documented in Roman legal texts and in personal correspondence, was not considered murder. It was considered a legal exercise of paternal authority. Women lived within this world of physical risk, alongside legal constraints that varied considerably depending on their social class, but never entirely disappear. Roman women of the upper classes had, by the standards of the ancient world, a relatively significant degree of practical autonomy. They could own property in their own right. They could enter into certain contracts. They could manage their own affairs to a degree that would have been unthinkable in classical Athens. But they could not vote, could not hold political office, and were subject to male guardianship in legal matters throughout their lives. Elite women managed households, raised children, influenced their husbands' social networks through the subtle mechanisms of Roman social life, and occasionally exercised considerable, behind-the-scenes political power. Women of the lower classes worked in shops, in markets, in agricultural labor, in trades, and their daily lives would have looked, in practical terms, considerably less constrained than the legal framework suggests, simply because survival required working, and working required moving through the public world. The religion that permeated every aspect of Roman daily life was not a comfort in the modern therapeutic sense. It was a system of obligation and negotiation, a framework of relationships between human beings in a polytheistic cosmos, populated by gods who needed to be propitiated, placated, and kept on your side. The Lares and Penates, the household gods, the protectors of the home and the larder, had their shrines in every Roman household, tended daily with small offerings. The calendar was a dense sequence of religious festivals, each with its own specific rituals, prohibitions, and required observances. Omens were taken seriously. The flight of birds, the behavior of sacred chickens, consulted before military decisions, the appearance of unusual natural phenomena all required interpretation by priests, trained to decode what the divine order was attempting to communicate. Superstition wound through daily life in ways that were inseparable from religion. Amulets were worn from birth against the evil eye, that ancient belief in the capacity of malicious glances to cause harm. Certain days were considered unlucky, the dies nefasti, on which important business should not be undertaken. Crossroads were sites of power, monitored by Hecate in the Laris Compitalis, the crossroads gods whose shrines required regular attention. Dreams were prophetic, and dream interpretation was a serious intellectual discipline. With its own professional practitioners, magic was real in the sense that most Romans believed it was real. And curse tablets, small sheets of lead on which a person inscribed the name of their enemy and a request for divine retribution, then folded and dropped into wells or left at sacred sites, have been recovered in the thousands from sites across the Roman world. They document, in the small angers and grievances of ordinary people, a world saturated with invisible forces that needed constant management. Against this background of superstition and religious obligation, the diseases that periodically swept through Rome with catastrophic effect were understood not as the consequence of germs, not as the predictable result of living 1 million people in close proximity without the sanitary infrastructure to prevent waterborne and airborne infection, but as divine punishment. The gods were angry. The rituals had been neglected. Some offense had been committed that required expiation. The response to epidemic disease was therefore as much religious as medical. Processions to temples, sacrifices, vows, the consultation of the Sibylline books, the collection of oracular prophecies kept by the Roman state precisely for moments of crisis. The two great plagues of the imperial period left marks on Roman history so deep that their reverberations extended for centuries. The Antonine Plague, named after the Antonine dynasty of emperors, and sometimes called the Plague of Galen after the physician who described it, arrived in Rome in 166 of the Common Era, carried back from Mesopotamia by soldiers returning from campaign against the Parthian Empire. The soldiers had encountered the disease during the siege of Seleucia, and they brought it home in their bodies, spreading it through the army and then through the civilian population of the empire as they dispersed to their stations and their homes. The disease, most historians believe it was smallpox or measles, or possibly both, spread from the eastern frontiers westward through a population that had no prior exposure to it and therefore no immunity. By the time the outbreak had run its first course, 15 years later, estimates suggested it killed between 5 and 10 million people, roughly 10% of the empire's total population. During the most intense phase in Rome itself, 2,000 people were dying every day. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled throughout the Antonine Plague and who dedicated much of his reign to managing both the disease and the military threats it created. The borders were difficult to defend when the army was sick. Died in 1980, possibly from the plague itself, though the exact cause remains uncertain. He left behind, among other things, his private philosophical notebook, the Meditations, which was never intended for publication and which reveals a man of extraordinary interior depth, trying to maintain equanimity in a world that was offering him very little material for it. 70 years later, Rome was struck again. The plague of Cyprian, named after the Christian bishop of Carthage who documented it in detail, providing the most comprehensive contemporary account of a Roman epidemic. Struck from around 249 of the Common Era and lasted for nearly 2 decades. At its height, according to the sources, 5,000 people per day were dying in Rome. The symptoms Cyprian described included fever, vomiting, inflammation of the eyes, the discharge of blood from the bowels, gangrenous extremities, and a progression that in its worst form moved from onset to death within days. The disease caused widespread agricultural labor shortages as workers died or fled, disrupted the army at a moment of serious military crisis, and killed 2 emperors, Hostilian in 251 and Claudius Gothicus in 270. The response of Christian communities, who organized to care for the sick regardless of religious affiliation, is credited by historians as one of the factors that accelerated the spread of Christianity through the Roman world. People who had been nursed through illness by Christians in a world where most people had fled from the infected tended to remember who had stayed. the religion that replaced the Roman polytheistic system, slowly, unevenly, through conversion and eventually imperial decree, would inherit and transform the culture it supplanted. But that is a story for another time. What concerns us here is the world that existed before that transformation, the world in which a Roman family, living on the fourth floor of an insula in the Suburra, woke each morning to the smell of the city. The noise of the carts that had been moving through the streets all night, the sound of the neighbors through walls too thin to provide privacy, the cry of the baby in the next room that had survived its first week and been given a name and was now, statistically speaking, more likely than not to die before its 5th birthday. The wealthy live differently. This cannot be overstated. The gap between the experience of a senator or a wealthy merchant and the experience of a laborer or a freed slave in Rome was not merely a gap in comfort. It was a gap in life expectancy. It was a gap in safety. It was a gap in the probability of surviving childbirth, of having clean water, of eating protein, of sleeping in a building that was not likely to burn down. The rich of Rome had private baths, gardens, abundant food, personal physicians, well-constructed houses set on solid foundations. They had, in other words, everything that insulated a person from the brutal physical consequences of living in a city with Rome's density and Rome's infrastructure gaps. And then beyond the city walls, many of them had country villas, estates in the hills, away from the summer heat and the summer diseases, where the air was cleaner and the water safer, and the crowds absent. The poor had the Colosseum. That is not entirely fair, and it is not entirely unfair. The gladiatorial games, the animal hunts, the public executions that filled the Colosseum's calendar were, in the Roman understanding, gifts from the emperor to the people, entertainment provided at enormous expense, free to attend, available to anyone who could get a seat. The Colosseum, which Vespasian began and Titus completed in 80 of the Common Era, could hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators. The seating was arranged by social class in a precisely calibrated hierarchy. Senators at the front, equestrians behind them, ordinary citizens in the middle tiers, women and the poor and slaves at the very top, in the steep wooden galleries under the open sky. Every class of Roman society attended, separated by their seats, but present in the same space, watching the same events. Those events were structured as an all-day program. The morning began with the venationos, the animal hunts, in which specially trained hunters, called bestiarii, faced exotic animals brought from across the empire. Lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses. These were not hunts in any sporting sense. They were demonstrations of Roman power over the natural world, displays of the empire's reach and its capacity to bring the remotest corners of creation into the arena for the entertainment of the city. The animals died mostly, though occasionally a bestiarius died too, and that was considered part of the excitement. At midday, while the senators and the respectable citizens went to lunch outside the Colosseum, this transition is documented in the sources, and its social meaning is clear. The arena hosted the public executions. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, slaves judged guilty of serious offenses, and in certain periods, members of religious minorities, including Christians, were brought into the arena and killed. The methods were varied: crucifixion, animal attack, combat against gladiators, and what the Harvard classicist Kathleen Coleman has called fatal charades. Staged reenactments of mythological scenes in which the condemned performed the role of a dying character. Their actual death providing the authenticity that performance could not. Laureolus, the notorious bandit whose story had been popular in Roman mind, was crucified in the arena and then attacked by a bear. His death transformed into theater. The afternoons belonged to the gladiators. The gladiatorial contests have been so thoroughly processed through 2,000 years of cultural retelling that it requires effort to see them with anything like historical clarity. The fighters were mostly enslaved people, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals who had been sent to gladiatorial schools rather than executed. though some free men, motivated by the prospect of fame, prize money, and a particular kind of celebrity, chose to enter the schools voluntarily. They trained intensively, ate a controlled high-calorie diet, and fought under strict rules administered by a referee. The fights were not always to the death. Returning a dead gladiator to the school that had trained him cost the sponsor of the games 20 times what returning a live one cost, which made economics a significant argument for clemency. But fights to the death did occur, and the crowd, whose collective opinion carried real weight in determining whether a defeated fighter lived or died, was not always inclined toward mercy. Seneca, who attended the midday executions by chance one afternoon and was horrified by what he saw, wrote afterwards that he came home crueler than when he left. He described the crowd's relationship to the spectacle with a precision that has aged very well. The mass appetite for violence, he noted, was not satisfied by violence. It was fed by it. The gladiatorial games lasted for centuries, reaching their peak between the 1st century before and the 2nd century of the Common Era, and they were still occurring well into the Christian period of the Empire. Honorius banned them in 399 and 404, but they apparently continued in some form for several more decades. The evening in Rome brought the taverns to life in a different way. The dinner hour for Romans was typically the late afternoon, the cena, the main meal of the day, taken after the work of the morning and the midday rest that the heat of Italian summers made advisable. For the wealthy, dinner was an occasion. Reclining couches around a central table, multiple courses, abundant wine, entertainment in the form of music or recitation or conversation. For the poor, it was bread and whatever else the thermopolium or the capone offered. After dinner, the night was technically available for recreation, but the lack of street lighting and the genuine danger of Rome's nocturnal streets meant that most ordinary residents stayed home or went short distances well known to them, and returned quickly. The gambling dens ran late. The brothels, which Rome had in abundance. The city had approximately 45 documented lupanaria, formal houses of prostitution, plus any number of informal arrangements in taverns, bathhouses, and private premises, operated through the night. The street gangs who found darkness profitable moved through the districts they controlled. And somewhere above all of this, in apartments that were cold in winter and suffocating in summer, that leaked when it rained and shook when a heavy cart passed too close, that smelled of too many people in too little space, and were lit by oil lamps that could start a fire if they tipped. Somewhere up there, exhausted Romans were trying to sleep. This was Rome, not the Rome of the marble temples and the triumphal arches, and the speeches and the legions and the grand sweep of imperial history. The other Rome, the Rome that the vast majority of its population actually inhabited. The Rome where the life expectancy at birth was somewhere between 25 and 30 years, where half of all children did not survive to adulthood, where disease moved through the insulae with the efficiency of a fire, where the gap between the citizen who could afford a private physician and the laborer who could not was a gap measured in years of life. The glory of Rome was real, the marble was real, and the aqueducts were real, and the roads and the legal system and the capacity for organization and engineering on a scale the ancient world had never seen, all of that was real, and none of it should be dismissed. Rome accomplished things that still impress us 2,000 years later, and justifiably so. But the ordinary person living inside the walls of this magnificent city, the person who woke up every morning on the 4th floor of an insula, in the Subura, who carried water up the stairs and cooked over a brazier, and walked carefully at night, and hoped the building wouldn't catch fire, and prayed that the baby would make it through the winter. That person was living a life that the marble and the monuments did not represent. They lived in the shadow of greatness, which is not the same as living in greatness. And the shadow was often, in ways that the grand narrative of Roman history rarely pauses to acknowledge, very dark indeed. History has a way of preserving the monuments and losing the ordinary lives. The Colosseum still stands. The Forum is still there. The aqueducts still carry their ghost of purpose across the Italian landscape. But the insulae are gone, collapsed and burned, and rebuilt so many times that almost nothing remains. The people who lived in them are mostly gone too, lost to the anonymity that has always consumed the poor and the average and the forgotten, absorbed into the aggregate statistics of population and disease and mortality that historians assemble from census records and grain tallies and tomb inscriptions. What we have left are the voices of the satirists who complained about them, the inscriptions on tombstones, too young, the graffitis scratched into the walls of Pompeii, preserved by the catastrophe that also killed the people who wrote it, the cursed tablets dropped into wells, the medical texts that describe in clinical Latin the diseases that went through a population living in conditions designed to spread them, the archaeological evidence of the bones, which carry in their density and their stress fractures and their calcified parasites, the quiet testimony of what daily life cost the bodies of the people who lived it. Rome was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of human civilization. And it was also, for the majority of the people who lived inside it, a place where life was shorter and harder and more dangerous than the gleaming version of history tends to acknowledge. Both of these things were true. That is what makes Rome so fascinating and so worth understanding clearly. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. There's something important about sitting with the full picture of the past, not just the monuments and the victories, but the ordinary lives lived in the shadow of all that greatness. The people who built the empire were also, in many ways, consumed by it. If this kind of calm, careful historical storytelling is something you come back to, a like and a subscription mean more than you might think. They help us reach people who are looking for exactly this. And wherever you found this video tonight, whether a friend mentioned it, or the algorithm found you, or you went looking for something to help you drift off, let us know in the comments. We always want to know how you got here. Rest well.